Good evening, everyone. Welcome to AIQRATE webinar specials CXO series. Today we have with us Rohit Gandhi, Editor-in-Chief, Democracy News Live, with us to discuss on the topic, Reimagine AI with New Lens, Possibilities in Media and Entertainment. This session will be moderated by Dhanrajani, CEO and co-founder, AIQRATE Advisory and Consulting. Before the session, some housekeeping rules for smooth flow of the webinar. I request all to be on mute to ensure no interruptions. Leave your questions in the chat window for us to take them up for Q&A. This webinar is being recorded and you can check the playback video on our website, www.aiqrate.ai. Now I would like to introduce Rohit. Rohit Gandhi has spent 3 decades in first being a frontline journalist covering war zones and then managing newsrooms and innovating technologies to make the life of journalists safe. He works on reducing global conflict by using journalism and good communication play a positive role. Rohit is an award-winning journalist with some of the highest honors like the Edward R. Murrow, DuPont Award, Golden Cine Eagle, Headliners Award, Webby Award, multiple Emmy nominations for investigative journalism, just to name a few. He uses AI for helping organizations look at open intelligence. Rohit is Editor-in-Chief at Democracy News Live. Prior to this, Rohit has held important roles in CNN, WION, NDTV, CBC, and South Asian International News. Rohit, it's an honor to have you in our CXO series webinar specials today. Thanks for making time. I'll now hand over the session to Samir. Samir, all yours.
Thank you.
Thank you, MK, for the introductions. And Rohit, it's a pleasure. This is our 35th webinar over the last 3 months, and no better than you having, being part of this particular session. And many of the feedback over the last few months while we've been doing this webinar, we've received about our inability to cover media entertainment in full gusto. And good part is that we have you who would not only talk about media entertainment, but I would like to cover one facet which is usually not talked about, journalism. And I think with the decades of experience, what you will have a very kind of an insightful session. So this is what I would like to do, Rohit, and spend some time, and this is something I'm sure our audience and participants who've joined globally would like to know, your professional background, your professional kind of a career, and how it's been the journey. And let me then take it from there in terms of touching few facets as part of the conversation.
Samir, thank you first for having me here. It's a pleasure, to join a whole group of people from around the world for this webinar. And, thank you for the opportunity of being able to speak to such a wide audience. Journalism and filmmaking is what I learned. That's where my start of my career was. I went to film school in Pune, and I realized that while we learned great skills how to do television, but we didn't really use it in journalism as much then, and television journalism specifically. So we kind of worked on it, and I said, well, I could go and make films, or I could go and do what I really like doing here. And so I decided to take the journey of being a journalist, telling television stories. A few years went by. I came from a military home. My father was in the Indian Army. And I realized that global conflict is a big issue. And people are very scared going to these global conflicts, especially people from the Indian origin weren't in wars. You would only see people from the West covering wars. And we have a great advantage as people from South Asia. When we go to these war zones, people in our region specifically, whether it's Iraq, whether it's Afghanistan, are very, very open to speaking with us. They really want to share their ideas. They have a sense of trust. And I began to leverage some of that. And I went to these frontline war zones. I was there in Afghanistan pre 9/11. I was there right after 9/11. I was there in Kandahar with the Taliban. I spent a great deal of time in Iraq, pre-Saddam Hussein's capture, and then I was there for the capture, and then went back into Afghanistan. So, I spent some of my first years there. One of the big things I realized when I went there is technology was always a big challenge. We used to carry huge satellite trucks. We began experimenting. I was at CNN International then. We began experimenting with the new technology to use what we are doing today, using very little bandwidth and sending video across the globe, and it's become the rule today. It was not possible then. I'm talking 2002. What we did is we took two satellite phones, we muxed those two satellite phones to give us a bandwidth from anywhere from 64 kbps to 256 kbps. I have no technology background, by the way, just to let you know. I've come from an entirely editorial background. And we muxed them and we began doing what we call video phone, live video phone from war zone fronts, because it was very difficult to set up satellites. And that's where our journey began. I began realizing how important a role technology plays in bringing the story home and making people realize. And it was path breaking. We were at front lines in hours, whether it was disaster zones, whether it was the Bhuj earthquake, whether it was Saddam's capture, whether it was, the fighting on the front lines in Afghanistan as we moved, front line to front line in 2001. And I kind of said, this is the only way forward. We'll have to continue innovating, and innovation has to happen by people like us who are out there who understand what we need. Somebody from the outside cannot come and figure out what is our requirement, how do we go about it, because it's difficult to be there. It's life and death, you have to move fast. We have to set up these equipments and cars and move. It was my first learning in technology, really, if I want to say that. Next step, I realized television is not the only thing. It's video, which is going to play the role. So I set up South Asian International News. This was in 2007. And we began having a website for putting out television news content. Come 2014, and we kept going that journey. I kept producing content and I kept innovating on technology. Come 2014, I had a conversation with the leadership team at Z, and we decided to set up a new television network. They came with a different idea. I said, well, we need an international news network. That's what's missing out of India. Many times people from here in South Asia feel that we don't have a voice. People don't really listen to us. So I said, that's the only gap. Everything else exists, but this is a gap we need to fulfill if we could. But it can only happen if we have great technology backing us. Poor tech's not going to help us. And so we decided to take that journey. I built Vion. I rehashed all of the DNA newspaper because I knew going forward, DNA as a newspaper, or any newspaper for that matter, is not going to be able to survive financially unless and until it has to sell its soul. And if you don't want to sell its soul, that means you cannot be in a losing business where you lose 8, 10, 15 rupees every time you sell a newspaper. So you have to go and sell your soul and get money from somewhere else and then put out the newspaper. I knew digital is the way forward. So again, the innovation continued. I also then, at that same time, started working on an AI tech. One of our biggest challenges is research. Artificial intelligence research is extremely, extremely important for us to scan material, open source material, and bring it in. So I partnered with the scientists at Harvard who were working on something like this, and we created technology to do open source intelligence. We work with some of the lead intelligence agencies providing open source intelligence to be able to scan content and figure out. So we look at 80,000 websites, scan them for you, summarize them for you all on the fly using open source intelligence. And so it's been a constant journey understanding technology. Now I use video tech, which is a lot AI, and we're working on kind of the way forward. And as we go along, we can talk about it. But just to give you a sense, the marriage between technology and editorial is intrinsic today. It's not two different worlds, and we must understand that. But at the same time, we have to also remember content continues to stay as king. Distribution was God, but today distribution is far easier. You don't have to own distribution, you must know how to produce great content.
Wonderful. I think if I just listen to, and I'm sure our participants must have been glued to listening, the fact that what you said in the earlier part of your narrative is nothing short of a pot boiler, as I say, and how you actually looked at this, what I say. If technology sometimes do not work, how do you enable that to kind of come out with those means to ensure that the right news comes out for the audience who really kind of see it as a part of, I would say, consumption. Switching gears, Rohit, and this is where I think the session will have more insights from you. I want to touch upon this whole aspect first on the media entertainment side. A lot has happened over the years, and specifically, you've seen this whole genre changing. Technology, so much of kind of influence in terms of different news having different connotations. But also, there is this whole facet with the likes of Netflix or Amazon Prime, what they've done. They've come out with this Uberization of content where content is the king, of course, but how it's consumed, how it's kind of, let's say, relayed is also important, as long as, I mean, we are able to take the customer preferences in terms of how we view. Now, these are some of the, I would say, topical patterns, but specifically as an expert in this area, what's your viewpoint in terms of the last, if you take 5 years of journey in media and entertainment, specifically on a broad basis, what are the trends you've seen in terms of some of these emerging things with what has happened?
You know, getting content and distributing it has always been the old business. But everybody realizes today, including Netflix. I just finished producing, I was directing the India bit of it for a film called Pandemic on Netflix. In January, we released it. Netflix itself realized that some of this content will have to be original. It cannot be all everybody else's content. And so while Netflix came in as a player looking at getting content from different people and putting it out, they realized that the content ownership will have to now sit with them. Now they're beginning to build that content themselves. Netflix, Amazon, Hotstar are all going out and saying, we are commissioning content. And
So let me chime in, and since you kind of produce one of the content and series for them, what's in their mind, Rohit, when they think about this original content? Because the reason I'm trying to emphasize about, I think many of our participants sometimes get swayed, hey, this is a trend and we should follow. But what's your view while you have worked with these large streaming kind of players, OTT players? What's your view on this, please?
So it may be a first stepping stone to be an aggregator, but content ownership is where everything will sit. Because sooner or later, you saw Disney exit Netflix, and Disney went out and said, well, why the hell should we be giving our content to Netflix? Let's go join hands with somebody else where we'll have more ownership of the content. And all of materials, content is where the SaaS model sits for anybody who does business today. SaaS is where the business is, which means the content is timeless. It's going to keep making money year after year after year. You can still hear some of the classics today, whether it's music, it's movies. So do you give away the ownership of that content on, where digitally it didn't matter, if you gave your rights away, but today digital is everything. The next 5 movies that you're going to see released in India, for example, is all on digital. They're not going to cinema halls. Cinema halls are shut. It's history, which means the main ownership of content on digital is going to be staying with people. If you have the ability of holding your content, you would, which means there are going to be more OTT players. You are going to see a mushrooming of OTT players. In fact, looking at what had to happen, one of our companies decided to put out an OTT for smaller companies who wanted to develop an OTT platform, including personalization, recommendation engines and all of that, and analytics on what happens with the content itself as it's viewed. So the journey is going to continue in content creation. More and more people will want to create that content so they have rights. But this is where the big fight is going to come.
Hmm.
Either those small production houses sell themselves out entirely to OTTs, or then they say, okay, stand by. I'm not giving my content anymore to these OTTs. And that's where the big challenge is going to come, because they're in every market, OTTs in every market trying to, capture the content. But more and more bigger houses realize that they can give out their OTTs, so they begin putting out their own OTTs. If you see some of the Indian players, they put out their own OTTs. And some of them have been around for a while. For example, Eros, if you wanted to take an example. And that's where I think the journey is going to be. Will a lot of the production houses who actually own 10, 15, 20, 30 movies say, I'm not going to go that route of giving it to the OTT, I'm going to own the content? Or the OTTs have enough money, which they do, because they're worth, if you look at Netflix net worth, it's about $22 billion.
Right.
And says, I'm going to be the one funding all the content from now on. And we are going to figure out the best content. We're going to pick up the best directors. And that's where we will own the content. It doesn't matter where it's going to get aired. So I think that's where the biggest fight's going to come when it comes to OTT and media at the entertainment side of the business.
Wonderful. So I want to touch upon two of the aspects you said about personalization and recommendation, and would like to peel both of them and would like to take some insights from you. Now, all these OTT players are just hopping upon the engines what they have, where the whole aspects of the customer preferences or the view audience preferences are mapped. You're able to see the I would say content what you like. You're able to personalize. You're able to see different genres. But that's one level which I think there is already a utopian situation which has been reached. On the other side, then we're talking about this concept, what we call cliffhanger moment, which means Netflix is trying to work with the production houses on this. And the best analogy would be, let's say, a movie Sholay, where maybe you didn't like Amitabh Bachchan, getting shot prematurely before the climax, and I didn't like why Sanjeev Kumar hands had to be amputated. And somewhere, I want to alter what I want to see basis my viewing preference, kind of a thing. So, which means, and this is where I would like to take your insights, being there in this kind of a, let's say, area for long. How does the whole back end, production, content, script, and this whole genre of kind of putting what I want to view becomes more possible in Tinable? Please help us explain.
So I'm going to handle it in two parts.
And
First, I'm
feel
going to
free to be
handle
provocative, Rohit, because this is where
first,
our audience would love it, please.
first I'm going to handle it from your perspective, where you think how this is going to get done. If you were, a Netflix asking a producer to say, can you give me 5 different journeys of this movie? We'll have to go all the way to the scripting end. We'll have to begin building that whole story in 5 different directions and look for 5 different endings. And then that means put out all that content based on personal preferences, obviously psychoanalysis of the individual on what he's watched and where do they want to see things, or we'd be able to then cater to that. But it's a whole production end that has to happen. It's not as if it's not an afterthought. You can't go to Sholay today and say, hey, Sholay is going to be in 5 different parts. Those guys are older today. You can't reproduce them in 5 different journeys, so you'll have to build a new Sholay for that matter. That is it possible? It is. It's not as if it's not possible. But now comes the point of the content creator. You have to remember the creative team's very finicky. You've written the story. Sometimes, directors like Satyajit Ray, if you went to him and said, will you produce this movie with this ending, he would say, bugger off. I'm not interested in seeing, producing this film. I see this movie as a creator. I'm not a salesman. I'm here to create this movie the way you want to see. I want to see it. This is how I envisage as the ending. For somebody else, it may be a journey that you want to take. But if you want to take that journey, go produce your own movie. This is the movie I'm offering. But what I think is an easier possibility is deeper dive into content and the interactivity of the content. So I watch a documentary, for example, and I want to see certain parts of that documentary in a more detailed manner. I should be
Right.
able to go from a 30-second clip of an individual to a 15-minute interview of that individual, because when you recorded that interview, you did watch 15 minutes. I may be watching a documentary from 15 parts of this world. I've seen only half an hour in the 6-hour pandemic series of India. I want to see 5 hours on India. I should be able to get a deeper dive, or on China for that matter, or wherever in the world you want to watch. And so I think that interactivity is probably more practical. There's 5, 6 ways of concluding it. A great idea for somebody who is on the business end and says this will sell, honestly, because if this is the ending, there'll be that many more people watching. But the creators in themselves, will you find those creators willing to bend and do what the demand is? I'm not so sure, because I think the creative group, whether it's entertainment or in the editorial, does not want to move. The ones who are very willing to move very easily pretty much don't have a backbone, and they're not really capable of producing that much. So I think that's going to be a fight between
If
one.
you look at this chain, and you rightly said, I think that there are, if I just call it for the lack of better word, a lot of naysayers in this scenario, because this is something which is an approach which is novel, not really mainstream, and there is always that, I would say, okay, how to enable that? On the other side, even the content today is getting germinated using machine learning algorithms. And I'll come to the journalism part, because that's where I really want more nuggets from your side. But keeping that for the time being, if the content gets germinated from the algorithms, you don't need maybe script writers for that. You can just create a kind of a story of different genre. And I'm just taking a possible sense. So how does it work in that scenario, Rohit?
The human mind, machine cannot create such uniqueness in content. I have worked with enough AI to be able to figure out that AI has limitations. And for a lot of people who said, oh my God, jobs are going to be gone, it's all going to be taken over by AI, if it will be, it's light years away. A human mind, the complexities of it, how it handled, cannot be taken over by AI. AI can play a great role in reducing your waste of time. Similarly, I understand when we go to our journalistic editorial,
Sure.
people want to watch and read things, and people will seed content based on what your searchability is. But you have to remember, that's not the only way to produce it. There will be still out people who will come up and produce great content, and all of a sudden that content is going to be hit, because everybody else has access to that same information, is producing the exact same content. And at the end of the day, people are just going to walk out and say, wherever I open, that's the only thing I see. Is there nothing else happening? So you're taking away from the uniqueness of the world when you begin falling into the algorithm and producing only what the algorithm produces. Today, for example, the story that people want to watch on television is India and China, as we go through this, near war situation. But the reality is that there's a lot else going on in the world. People get tired of that same story. COVID as well. You put out information on COVID, and people say, I am overdosed on COVID. And
Right.
it's important to know it. So I think that uniqueness in content is going to continue creating paths and journeys for people. And people will sooner or later punch out. People said television news needs to be all aggressive and people need to be screaming. They want opinionated anchors. Sure, today they do, but it's going to end. It's not going to last there forever. So the uniqueness in your ability to create content, to really have ideas which are brand new, to show things which other people aren't showing, is going to continue being your unique spot. If you lose who you are as a basis based on an algorithm, you had a pretty weak basis to start with. So you better begin figuring out if that's your basis. If you as a basis, your value system, your ability to create content is unique, then you would do it. Many people looked at it and said journalism will only work if we side with the government. It doesn't work like that. People who are going to continue doing real serious journalism and not selling themselves out sooner or later will come right back up. This may last for a year or two transition. And I always say people who hold through transitions are the ones who hold steady and hold for long. The ones who keep jumping with transitions to one side or the other, they will crash sooner or later. Their journey is going to be much shorter. I always call it the difference between a leopard's run and a horse's run. The horse runs for 60 kilometers an hour for 2 kilometers. The leopard does 100 meters and it's done. So you have to decide whether you're going to be this leopard or you'll be the horse.
Wonderful, wonderful. I think this sums up the part which I think you aptly put it. I mean, you got to make a choice between a horse and being a horse or a leopard. Let me come to the facet, Rohit, and I'm also kind of mindful of the questions which are streaming in. And let me take that kind of a thing blended with the questions I also have around this journalism part. Uh, this whole aspect today, we are talking about technology, specifically AI pervading within journalism. Now, just for a campaign to go viral, there are enough techniques around metadata, all those kind of hyperlinking, and irrespective whether the content is fake or authentic, the virality of the campaign can either cause havoc or can really be beneficial for the citizens or the viewers. Which direction do you believe today journalism is going, and how technology, specifically AI, from your vantage point, will kind of look at journalism, whether it's kind of going to be a kind of a, let's say, a very different kind of, let's say, viewpoint over there, or you believe there'll be some sanity checks through regulations and privacy laws? And I've made it a bit of, I'm sorry, a bit layered because I just blended some of the questions which are also streaming in.
You know, journalism is going through possibly its most challenging phases of the 21st century. The last, I would say, maybe 5 years has seen possibly only yellow journalism. It's gone through its worst phase. Many of us have been, very, very disappointed at the turn it's taken, the lack of independence that's come in, the way the ownerships are structured, the way journalists are not able to deliver the work they wanted to deliver. Earlier, the systems were strong enough for the corrupt to get weeded out. It's not as if corrupt journalists didn't exist before. They did. They always were. Where the human beings, there will always be corruption. But the kind of peakness and corruption that we've seen today is never been seen in the history of journalism, of the hundreds of years it's been around. And I think this is where both AI and I want to add here blockchain are going to play the largest role. AI is going to be
both AI and blockchain. Great.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because AI is going to primarily be accessible to everybody. It's not as if it's not already accessible. At a great level it is, but it's going to be more and more accessible. So the information that you get and gather is going to be available for everybody. What people are looking for, how much people are asking for it, where are people going for it, how do they go about it, or what is the kind of overarching view. So this is where blockchain is going to come in, because the challenge is fake content. Anybody says anything, there is no other way to, double check it. Now, this has been also one of my focus areas for the last 4 years. Blockchaining, that means ownership of content will sit with content creators at many, many levels. Each individual, just the way an Uber driver or an Airbnb host is a hotel, is an entrepreneur, journalists will be entrepreneurs, but they will be responsible for their content. Earlier, chain of hotel puts up 500 rooms, boom, you sell it. Just like a newspaper or a television channel, big huge television network. This, from my perspective, is going to have to change, because a lot of the ownership of those networks is highly, highly sitting in bed with other parts of, whether it's the legal community, whether it's the political community. military complexes, defense companies, anybody who wants to sell anything, partners, and boom, you're in that little lap, and it's a changed world. The ownership of that content is going to land up with people. And any time somebody produces content will have to be original content. You cannot be sitting in studios and trying to sell somebody else's content. Because any time that story plays, the money goes back to the person who originally created the content. People may take away shares out of that money, but the main ownership of that content must stay with them, which means tomorrow, if there is fake news, you know where it's come from.
But this is where, Rohit, I want to chime in and take your views. Now, having listened to your entire professional journey, when you talked about these war zones where you were reporting from the trenches, being a trooper, you actually looked at taking that information, turning that information into news which was credible at the source, at the ground. Today, if we really look, that's not happening because one of the plausible reason by many of these journalists, hey, when it's available on the web, why kind of not lift and shift it? So what's the thing happening over there? If I may just ask you.
It's mass scale plagiarism. The
Right.
thousands of websites you see are all people who are scraping content, rewriting content. So we've taken a whole generation of the last 5, 10 years and we've made plagiarists. Original content creators are limited. Some one person writes a story, 5,000 people rip that story, rewrite it, and obviously, the 500 person writing that story is going to add a little bit of his own, and now you have an entirely different reality. And this plagiarism must end when it comes to creation of content. Again, I'm going back to what you were talking about, is if AI and algorithm is going to tell you everything what to do, everybody's going to write the same content. And as soon as everybody writes the same content, it's now boring. So you have to go back to the original creator, and that's where it's going to sit. Ownership of that content must sit with the creator. We must know the ownership, and when that content creator becomes a rogue creator, then that content creator must be killed by the community itself. So a whole group of people would sit on some of these blockchains and say, we own this blockchain for a good journalism platform. This blockchain is going to determine what are our standards. When somebody puts up a complaint, you put out coins saying, I'm going to challenge this news story because I don't think this is original. A committee sits down, says, is it original or is it being messed around with? If they figure out that you messed around, they take all your blockchain coins and they transfer the blockchain to the person who's launched the complaint, which means for you being somebody who's going to check that the newsworthiness of that content is now going to be able to get money out of it as well. So you're going to be careful. You as a content creator knows I've made 5 years of work. I've created myself in the blockchain. I have a certain stature. By putting one piece of bad news content, I'm not going to lose the 20,000, blockchain points on my news chain. And so I think both those are going to continue playing a major role. And I think this is the future of news content, is how it's going to take shape, how people are going to own this news content. And this is where the honesty is going to come around. You should be able to, on Twitter, I always say you should be able to see a green box around your photo and say, is this photo blockchained or not? Has it come from a person or not? And, I've been working on it for 4 years now. So I can, get into a little more detail once we, want to talk a bit more about it if somebody has questions. But this is where it needs to go. It cannot stay in the structure today because it's unfortunate. A company which is large, which has multiple businesses, and a government says, I don't want this story, or a company says, I don't want this story, and they're the big advertisers, the news network or a news network for a government has to take down that story. Otherwise, they'll be finished. Tomorrow, there are arrests, they're taking them to court, they're doing all of that, and that has to go. So, how do you sustain? You can't go and kill 1 million content creators globally and they have a certain stature. You go out after a content creator who produces 10,000 pieces of content which are honest. You can't go and as a government and say, I'm going to take this person down. There'll be 10,000 other people backing him. So I think there's going to be a massive move towards just honesty of journalism. The honesty will have to return, and I don't think people themselves want to not see real information.
Awesome. So if we just expand that, Rohit, are you suggesting the governments of the respective geographies and nations putting together regulations about this? Because fake news, to the point what you mentioned, is nothing short of a pandemic today. We've realized the kind of havoc and the fatalities it can cause, really swinging the opinions and biasness. Having said that, also, there is also one viewpoint today that one aspect is what news channels today are kind of broadcasting. The other side of the picture is the Twitters and the Instas of the world, which are streaming content, uploading, downloading, carries on 24 by 7. So, as an audience or as a viewer, as a citizen, and I'm just getting into their shoes, how does technology work to enable what's fake and what is
Yeah,
it's not fake?
both you
And
where
I'm linking both the government and for the citizen because
there
that's
are
something
three.
that, yeah,
You have three
please go.
questions, and I'll answer one after the
Yeah,
other. First one is government trying to determine regulations.
yes.
Sure, you can have regulations, and you must have regulations. There's no problem in having regulations as long as you're doing honest work, but it should not become a way of controlling news. Governments are bound to try and do that. Just last week, I was hearing from Pakistan that government is trying to put in, a code in place where basically they'll be able to control China, for example, many other countries around the world, UAE, anywhere you see, government has massive controls, and that's no way of doing journalism. That's certainly not the way forward of doing journalism. I think there must be rules, there must be independent bodies, but these independent bodies cannot be made by just the few top 5 channels and say, I'm the body. That's not how it's done. All journalists, just like a democratic organization, should be able to vote their bodies in.
Right.
It means you take 20,000 journalists in India, people stand for elections, they get voted in. Now that's the leadership. It should not be as if, you create these bodies out of, a few owners sit together and say, these are the 5 people who make the body of television. That's not how it's done. That's a very bad way of doing it. And rules and regulations then must come from that body where verifying content. And if you find, let's say, a channel puts out one fake news, one wrong news, you should be able to take the channel down next minute. Because that the body has decided this channel needs to go down tomorrow morning, which means the government then has no role in it. The government should say, all right, you've given us enough proof, we have to take it down. And that's where government can play a role. But if a channel or a newspaper is aligned to a government and government doesn't want to take it down, then the whole purpose is defeated. You don't have journalism. Question number 2. You talked about content being downloaded by Twitter or people commenting, all of that.
Yeah, and there are countries without naming them who put in huge swamp of people kind of generating content just to swing opinions. Yeah,
Fake news.
yeah.
And I'm continuing to say this, that each of that piece of content should be blockchained. Anytime somebody downloads that content and repurposes that content, the ownership of the content must stay with it. And because of that ownership of that content, the money still keeps going to the creator. And anybody who takes that content and now alters it should not have the verification of the content available with them as original creators, because it's already known that this has been downloaded and played around with.
And it's encrypted end to end.
Absolutely. And it's blockchain end to end, which means anytime a download happens, there has to be a reason for the download. There has to be money paid for the download. It cannot be reused without the money being paid to the original creator. And I think that's where a lot of the technology play is going to come in. Also, you've seen Twitter recently said you can write your posts and you can block people from writing comments on it because they realize it became such an abusive platform. People were swearing left, right, and center. The kind of abuses I whenever I see, even if I don't get abused, when even I see somebody else being abused, whether they're friends or not or whatever, I immediately report it. Because I think making these platforms clean and humane and making sure that we deliver a world to our children which is worth living in, we must be responsible ourselves. And we must take responsibility not just for ourselves, but for the others who are trying to mess around with the platform. We don't want to create an uncivil world where people will be screaming at each other to have a conversation. We should be able to stop at the end of our conversation and we should let the other person speak. And I think that's a whole new genre that we need to clamp down on. We've lost basic civility in our approach of debating. Debates doesn't mean you begin slamming people and abusing people. And I think that's where the biggest change is going to come. These social media platforms will have to make sure that this abuse has to stop. And the ability of the content's use, the originality of it, no fake news possibilities have to be part of the content. The blockchain has to be part of social media platforms. And I think that's where it's all going to sit.
Wonderful. I want to take one question which is interesting, and that's one of the, I would say, from the segment of debate we haven't covered is this whole aspect. And there is an analogy within this question that in our formative years during school and college education, there used to be some of these cult faculties or teachers. The moment they used to enter the classroom, it used to be shock and awe, more of a shock than awe. So is if we see today, in the last few years, we had the news anchors coming in. Many of them have created their own brand, more, vantage positioning in terms of how they exude in terms of providing news. But at the same time, they are being challenged by AI anchors, AI-driven anchors. China has already tested kind of that thing, and US is trying to do with a couple of channels over there, which eliminates the need of a person to do 24/7 reporting on the go. What's your take on this, Rohit?
People in Japan decided to have friends as apps and dolls and all of that. I don't think it changed the format for the rest of the world. Well, we play around with, just basic news delivery. But a human being to human being contact, I think, is the EQ is something that's not replaceable. And we'll have to realize that, sure, we'll come and it could just be an anchor delivering information to you from different places. And it's a possibility. And even if we decide to replace it with a human being, it's not a huge cost change for us. A human being, being the anchor in between versus an AI anchor. People are going to get bored of the same, faces and all of that. So human anchors certainly, will offer that. Now, the anchors of today, which you discussed, obviously, are an entirely different lot. The anchors of today are, I'm sorry, they should work in entertainment and not really work in news. The ones who work in news deliver information and they deliver honest information. And that's becoming a reality today, that they do not deliver honest information. Many of them sold to parties, many of them belong to political parties, many of them sold to large companies which have business interests. So that's where, the change is required. And I'm positive, the rest of humanity doesn't want that. They can be fooled for a little while, but you can't fool them for the rest of their lives. People will recognize that honest journalism is important for them, at least if we want to live in the democracies we want to live in. It's all part of the democracy. And if we don't see that honesty coming through, people sooner to say, oh, well, this is lies. I bought into this for a few years, but I think I really understand it now. So technology certainly is going to continue playing a very, very large role. It's going to bring about the honesty. It's going to help us bring about, distribution of the wealth that gets created and the comms that gets created. But I think human beings are irreplaceable at many, many levels. We cannot get rid of them entirely. Even if, you have an anchor in between, you still need a journalist to go out on the field and pick up content. What about that? You can say you can have a robot doing it. No, the human beings, a robot will take way too much complexity to figure out how to pick up a story from a little small town in Orissa or in Manipur to reach there and, bring that information back. So I think human beings are certainly part of the development of technology. we can leverage it better, we can continue creating great technology, and we can continue working with great technology to deliver great information, which can help us become a better world. And that's what its role is. And I think that's where our strength needs to lie in, is focusing on what we're going to do as we move forward.
Wonderful. So one of the things, Rohit, and there is also a question which even I had was, and I'm trying to blend with the questions streaming in from audiences. Take a sneak peek, 2025, 5 years from now. What do you, and you've been advocating AI and blockchain a lot, which is quite revealing, because I don't think so in any of the conversation we have heard about such use cases. So it's very interesting to kind of know about that. Specifically, what's your take on the future where technology will would be very seamless, embedded, pervasive within media, entertainment, journalism. But 5 years from now, how do you think this whole world of media and entertainment will evolve? So that's one. And second, journalism, because that's a separate segment and genre altogether.
One of the first things that needs to happen is a 360 camera in the field. We're done with the two-dimensional image. People, just the way you talked about, I want to interact and I want to see different parts of the movie. When it comes to entertainment, I want to take a different journey that, hands of Sanjeev Kumar don't get cut, or, for people who don't understand, this is an Indian movie called Sholay, where, and the people don't want to see Amitabh Bachchan get shot or whatever. Similarly, there are certain parts of the protest I may want to see. There is a camera looking at people protesting. I don't know what the image is at the back. I don't know what the image is on the left, what's on the right, what's happening in the sky. I have no idea. I think first that needs to happen. People need to interact with the image they want, and then want to go back and then watch other angles of that same camera. I think that's going to be the first little journey from going from just a flat 2D image to a 3D image. And that's the first change. It's going to be possible using the 5G, which is coming up whenever it does, because we'll need that kind of bandwidth to stream the 360. Beyond that, with virtual reality in place, people will be able to walk to these places and actually begin seeing and discovering what's where, a far greater ability. So you put up 10 cameras in a location, and people can see what was happening in these 10 different spots at that given point of time, and then understand reality. Let's say there is a protest happening. People are pelting stones from one end to another end where the military is getting ready, to the third end where somebody's been injured and is being taken, fourth end where doctors are working, fifth end, there'd be n number of possibilities. And I think it's going to be a world of possibilities with technology. As we move forward, we want to continue going that direction. There may be a drone camera where people want to see a 360 view. You should be able to scan through and say, all right, I'm going to zoom in there and I'm going to see what's happening here. And so I think people's ability and control on the information is what's going to be very, very important.
So the whole aspect, what you said, the AR, VR part, augmented and the virtual reality will get more enhanced. That's what you're saying. It will get more blended in the whole media entertainment space.
It is going to be a very important part of the whole media, news, and entertainment space. And I think that's where the biggest change is going to come as we move forward in this.
Okay. Any other kind of, let's say, trends, what you perceive in a few years from now? A Minority Report kind of a thing coming in where you can just glance the news on the go or create your own kind of a content?
360 AR, VR.
Sure.
Blockchain of people being paid who produce the content. And then finally, personalization of the information that you'd like to see and focus on what you want to see. And then the service of that tech. You could ask for stories to be done for you specifically, saying, I want this story. Can you give me a little more detail? I heard something about this story. I'm willing to fund the story for $100. Can you cover the story for me? And people beginning to take control of what information they see. It shouldn't be just what I want to show you. I said, I have a problem with that politician. I heard this is what happened. Can you dig that story for me? I said, all right, you will have to commission this journalist. You'll be able to directly communicate with the journalist and the rest of the world can see that story.
Wonderful, wonderful. Rohit, and this question I want to take, which is very, very interesting, maybe something we haven't covered, but would love to take your views. The barks of the world who are really looking at this whole broadcasting of the news and the content and really trying to gauge the mood, behavior, experiences of the audience. The approach seems to be a bit primitive because with artificial intelligence influencing video detection techniques, the whole aspect of how the assessments and audit needs to be done is way off what's being done today. To give an example, it's like if I'm looking at you, I'm just nodding my head. That's not conclusive that I'm really engaged in the conversation. Because if I have the crow's feet, which is getting into the facial techniques, and by AI algorithm, it can be very well deduced that the person is faking emotions or maybe any kind of a lump in the throat. Now, over there, the question is more about can such techniques around computer vision, image classification, voice sentiment analysis can be used to start assessing and maybe trying to come out with a kind of a rating mechanism for each and every program or content which gets streamed. Your thoughts, please.
Absolutely. And you're bang on. That's our next layer. And this layer, and we've been talking about this layer for many years as well. And I think these layers will continue to grow and develop as algorithms get better and better. And I think that we'll continue seeing that journey. But this is going to be continue giving us feedback mechanism rather than conclusive answers. It'll give us a great opportunity to understand how did people react to this story. And if there are 200 people, looking at the seminar, we'll be able to, or the webinar, we'll be able to understand is what was their people's reaction, what did they like, what did they not like, how did they react to this information, even though we may not be seeing all of them on screen right now. But a decent analysis of their facial expressions could tell us the kind of reaction people had with different things. Was it disgust? Was it surprise? Was it happiness? Was it anger? And I think that's where we'll be able to use the analytics. And what you've done for so long is analytics continues to stay one of the cornerstones of us understanding information and dealing with information, whether it's big data to understand any of this.
In fact, interestingly, what you said so well resonates in one of the use case we are working for a client from a media entertainment, specifically in this whole part of the pandemic where you can't visit stadiums. Spectators are not allowed. So the mandate is more about through the facial techniques and kind of, let's say, video detection techniques, can you assess how much audience were engaged, of course, on an extrapolation basis in terms of the total duration of the match, so that whether the stadiums are empty, does it really fetch the eyeballs from a kind of, let's say, media point of view? And accordingly, as you know, then the ad rates may differ basis the engagement level. So, you truly said the same thing. Switching gears.
I want to raise, 3 years ago, I worked with a producer
Sure.
who was working with Microsoft's new tech. They were doing a film around it, and I found it very interesting. The tech would cut down the highlights of the match based on AI.
Mm-hmm.
You didn't have to watch the whole map and begin cutting, an editor didn't have to sit. By the end of the match, 2 minutes later or 30 seconds later, the highlights were already ready. All you have to do is say highlights of, the final of Wimbledon today. That was it. And so human beings will be taken away from repetitive tasks.
So let me ask you, in relative comparison, in your yesteryears, how much time it used to take to kind of, edit this whole highlighting feature in terms of the salient kind of coverage?
Could be a few hours.
Right, which is cut down to almost like few minutes now.
10 seconds.
Yes.
The AI we use for news and with multiple intelligence agencies around the world does 80,000 web pages every 10 seconds. And it summarizes on the fly in 10 seconds a million articles. It writes the headlines, it summarizes the pieces. It's not just picks out sections, it summarizes them and throws out a million pieces every 10 seconds. And any information you receive, you see 20 articles written about your company, and you say, what has been written, it's all summarized, and it can be leveraged, it can be interacted with. It also gives you a slice and dice of the keywords that went in, which means the topics, which is the SEO bit. So you know exactly what you need to search, or the individuals, or the organizations, or the places involved in this article. So all of a sudden, you have such deep dive with you taking big data in place that you have the ability to understand where it's going, how this story is going to land up being, and how do you make sure that you stay part of that conversation. That information is going to be with everybody, hopefully. But it's today, it's already there. People still aren't using it as enough. And I think that's where it needs to, continue moving towards.
Wonderful. Rohit, I want to take the last question. You touched upon Microsoft, and this is the question where the participant has asked, with these large technology behemoths, Amazon, Microsoft, Facebook, Google, what's your perception about some of them venturing into and investing big into media and entertainment? Will the landscape of how media, news, and entertainment exists today will change because of these behemoths doing some big mergers, acquisitions as part of the strategy, or you believe there will be a different story altogether?
100%. They are the most powerful today. They are going to continue taking over. Those are realities of the time. And, between Microsoft, when we talk about, technologies which are non-intrusive at many, many levels, they give you, I don't want to, distinguish between them, but anytime a technology takes a role of being a tech and doesn't become the controlling authority, it stays a good tech. As soon as it becomes colored and then begins taking control and begins selling its soul. So it shouldn't be that, a player decided to buy that technology and now the highlights that are coming are only of that player. But if you are a platform which now says, I've taken money from this political party and I'm only going to show stories about this political party up front and center, now I have become the same issue which I had before. Here is a corrupted, biased information provider. So I think people are smart enough and it's not going to happen. It may happen for a few years in the transition period, it may happen, but people are too smart to, get fooled long term. And I think that's where it's going to sit. They will buy, they will try and buy, they'll try and control, they'll even try and control governments if they have to. But I don't think they will go on forever.
Rohit, as expected, enthralling, riveting, engrossing. I think the spectrum of themes, topics, perspective you covered were amazing because comprehensively with each of these data points, what you mentioned, you had this whole aspect of almost advocating that technology needs to be used end to end. In my often kind of meetings and these sessions, we have faced one side of the spectrum, whether it's a technology maven coming in or a kind of a, let's say, business leader coming in. But I think for the first time, I'm sure, and I'm trying to also gauge the audience's, I would say, reception while it's coming in. We've got a blend of a professional and leader who has an equal understanding of the business domain, which is media, news, and entertainment, and not to take out the whole aspect of how you can actually use technology, which you rightly provided in terms of AI, blockchain on those AR, VR examples. Thank you so much and really appreciate your time. I know you have a packed schedule, but really appreciate you taking time and thank you so much and all the best.
And thank you very much for having me here.
Thanks, Roy. Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Thank you. Bye-bye.